first officially open the meeting, then welcome members of the 4 standing committees of the NA and the NCOP. Let me welcome the Deputy Minister, Dr. Masondo. Welcome the chairpersons of the standing committees, Comrade Eunice Karin, Comrade Fiscal Butelezi, Comrade Dikeledi Mahlangu, you are all welcome. Let me welcome the chairpersons of finance committees in the 9 legislatures, the PBO director and the entire PBO team, FFC, the parliamentary support teams or secretariat of all the 4 committees, the DG of National Treasury and his colleagues, the media, and the public in general. You are all welcome. Let's move to item 2, apologies. Secretariat.
Hi, morning, Chair. This is Nkulula Kwamangweni from the Select Committee on Finance. There were no apologies. Thank you, Chair.
Good morning, Chair.
Morning, Luwalo.
Yes, it's Luwalo, Chair. I have an apology for Honorable Mahlangu. She is traveling from Japan to Cape Town, Chair. She will join the meeting as soon as she arrives this side, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And then...
Good morning, Chairperson. No apologies were received from the Standing Committee on Appropriations.
Okay. Morning, Chair, Alan. From Standing Finance, it's only voter vessels.
Okay, Alan. Thanks. We're done with item 2, apologies. Let's move to item 3, briefing by the Minister, MTBPS 2021. Over to you, Deputy Minister, Dr. Mason.
Thank you, Chair. And let me acknowledge all the chairpersons, as you have correctly acknowledged them. Chairperson, Jomo Songani, and the National Treasury team, the Standing Committee members, finance and other committees, and the parliamentary staff, which really does a lot of work in helping us to set the good conditions for us to have this conversation. Members of the media and all South African. I will not say a lot because I take it that we've listened very carefully, reread the minister's speech last week that he presented. And on Thursday, we've also provided a number of documents, which I assume that colleagues have read. So we are mainly here, Chairperson, to receive your critical feedback and support, as you always do, on behalf of South Africans. Just key points to remind ourselves on what we're trying to convey to South Africans. I mean, firstly, South Africa, as we know, is continuing in its battle against the impact of COVID-19, as well as the pre-COVID socio-economic challenges that have been made worse by the pandemic. And we know those triple challenges: inequality, unemployment, and poverty. And unemployment in particular has reached 34.4%. The purpose, of course, of this MTBPS was to provide the nation with some update on the fiscal framework implementation, basically reporting back on revenue, expenditure, debt levels, and more importantly, Chair, on economic growth, because this is a very important variable that will have an impact on other variables such as your unemployment, revenue, and our ability to deal with the debt levels. But secondly, this MTBPS, just to remind ourselves, was also to present the immediate future, how the future looks like, and how we intending as government to position government insofar as the fiscal framework is concerned. And that future will be firmed up in February when the minister come back to present the budget. So between now and February, as government, we will deliberate on the most appropriate priorities that will be targeted, and with special emphasis on job creation, poverty alleviation, as well as peace and security. This process, of course, Chair, will also include an assessment of opportunities for policy trade-offs, and we will maintain fiscal sustainability. The need to address socioeconomic challenges must be balanced with the critical need to ensure fiscal sustainability, mainly by dealing with the South Africa's unsustainable debt burden. I mean, we know that the debt now, it will reach 4.3 trillion this year. And the debt attracts debt service cost. There's no free debt. Debt comes with cost. It's like if you go to the bank and borrow money, the bank charge you interest. Similarly, as government, as we borrow money, we get charged interest. And our debt service cost now is 303 billion. It will be in 2022, 2023. And over the MTF period is going to be 1 trillion. So can you imagine if that we didn't have debt, and I'm not saying debt in itself is bad, it depends on what you're borrowing for, but imagine if we didn't have this debt, this 1 trillion should be going to education, health, and other important expenditure items. So debt does crowd out important expenditure item. And not only that, it does also crowd out private sector investment. Can you imagine, Chair, if our deficit, for argument's sake, it's 500 billion, and South Africa has only saved 500 billion in that year. What it means is that if we are successful in borrowing that money, all that money is going to go to government, and the private sector will be left with nothing to invest. So high debt, unsustainable debt, it's not in the interest of economic growth. It's not in the interest of the poor. But like I said, if you borrow, you've got to borrow at least for growth enhancing activities, not just for immediate consumption. So fiscal consolidation is critical to reduce the public debt burden, to restore investor confidence and avoid exposure to global and domestic risks. So the MTBPS proposes to maintain restraint in public expenditure, and government will not commit to new long-term spending in response to the temporary revenue that we obtained as a consequence of the good performance of the mining sector. So what we are doing, Chair, like I said, yes, we're borrowing because borrowing in itself, it's not bad. And government is committed to fiscal consolidation. And in the short term revenue that we obtained out of this opportunity insofar as the mining growth is concerned, which has given us extra revenue against the estimated revenue. We won't use the short-term revenue to fund long-term spending commitments. And over the next 3 years, government will balance support for economic recovery and reconstruction through both short-term spending measures, rebuilding public finances, and structural reforms, because these structural reforms are critical for us to put South Africa on a much more sustainable economic growth so that we don't depend on temporary cyclical growth, either because of some good performance by a particular sector like mining in this regard. And these structural reforms, Chair, are very important, and government has made a lot of progress in this regard in the energy sector, notwithstanding the current challenges insofar as energy supply, but we have increased the licensing requirement from 1 megawatt to 100 megawatts, and we think that this will enable, will increase the electricity supply to the economy, and municipalities now can generate their own power or procure electricity from independent producers. And through Operation Vulindlela, Transnet through the department, because the department is an implementer, or departments and entities are implementers of these reforms. Transnet now has corporatized the National Port Authority, which will improve incentive for efficiency and competitiveness. And the e-visa will be rolled out to 15 countries by March 2022. And Operation Vulindlela continues to monitor and support implementation of these reforms. And there are other reforms, Chair, that we are identifying as Operation Vulindlela. At the right time, we'll come to the committee and articulate those reforms, because as we make advances in certain reforms, progress in certain reforms, we want to move to other reforms so that we really unleash the economic potential of our economy, because growth, it's very critical for us to deal with all these challenges that we are facing. And my parting shot, Chair, is that the budget is pro-poor and is mostly focused on social wage, which is the combined public spending on health, education, housing, social protection, and employment programs and local amenities. So the social wage remains very high by global standard, averaging 60% of consolidated non-interest spending over the next 3 years. And Chair, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. And we, as always, we're looking forward to your critical support, because we know that your support is not a blind one. It's support that is critical of the things that we are doing right. It's critical of the things that we should be doing and not doing, and how we can improve our public finances. And we all do this in the interest of South Africans. So we always take your criticism as criticism coming from a good heart, as criticism coming from an attempt to make South Africa better for all South Africans. So let me ask DG and his team to take us through, Chair, the details of the MTBPS as we presented it through a condensed speech presented by the Minister last week, Thursday. And I really also want to reiterate that the apology of the Minister that he could not make it today. and also apologize for the postponement of this meeting, which was supposed to have taken place last week, Thursday. We really want to apologize for that, Chair, and we hope that you will accept both the Minister's apology, which is also beyond his control. He would have loved to be here, and also the postponement last week. Thank you, Chair. DG, over to you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. Good morning, Minister, honourable members again. Chair, we have asked Mr. Edgar Sishi, the head of the Budget Office, to take us through the presentation. It's not a long presentation, but he'll try and cover as much as possible, because the Deputy Minister has outlined a few thoughts and reasons, reasons why we approach the budget, the MTBPS the way we did. But Edgar, if you are ready, please feel free to continue. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, DG. Chair, with your permission through you, let me then go into the slides that we are presenting today and begin with the overview, which I won't go through in detail because this obviously has been made available both on the website as well as in the documentation that was tabled on Thursday. Suffice it to say that, as the Deputy Minister was indicating, the pre-existing challenges that were facing the South African economy have, of course, been magnified by the pandemic. At the same time, the fiscal weakness that was a challenge prior to the pandemic has also been magnified. So there is a balance that is necessary in the fiscal strategy between providing continued support to the economy in the short term and, on the other hand, rebuilding the public finances. One of the reasons for this is that even though the economy has recovered quicker than we expected, the long-run durability of the recovery, not just domestically but globally, is uncertain. And for that reason, it is important that should there be another downturn down the road, that the policy environment, particularly fiscal policy, is prepared to deal with that emerging risk. At the same time, there are significant risks that are already in place to the fiscal outlook, including as they relate to the impact of the debt burden, as well as issues around the state-owned companies and the risk emanating from there. But going then into the details in the presentation, as you can see in the slide, which is a table published in Chapter 2 of the MTBPS, you can see the recovery both in the global economy as well as among emerging market and developing countries. As is usually the case, emerging markets are the main drivers of the recovery. But the recovery in general is stronger than anticipated. For South Africa, the National Treasury's forecast is for a growth of 5.1% real GDP growth this current year, which again is higher than what we had projected at the time of February. But again, that's true for all economies around the world. We've seen the uptick stronger than what we thought. However, we are seeing risks rising, as well as the fact that the scarring from the pandemic continues to be a major factor in how we think about the forecast going forward. A number of the risks include vaccine access globally, not just from a health perspective, but also from the confidence building perspective. People are more likely to go out and engage in economic activity if they feel safer, as well as monetary and fiscal policy support. And of course, the emerging challenge of inflation that is now becoming an increasing risk globally as well as domestically. With respect to the projections for other economic variables, you can see how on the inflation front, inflation will remain anchored in the midpoint of the band over the forecast period. However, at the same time, it is important that we take careful note of the fact that even as we've seen a bump in the current year, that bump is mostly led by household consumption. We expect that to slow down quite a bit over the MTF period. But an even bigger concern than that, Chair and honorable members, is the fact that investment as a percentage of its contribution to the overall economy remains relatively weak. And that is mainly driven by poor private sector investment, as the Deputy Minister was indicating earlier. So revitalizing private sector investment is going to be a key part of addressing issues around the durability of the recovery going forward. And of course, at the same time, the challenges around unemployment, which the Deputy Minister has already alluded to. Given the pre-existing challenges as well as the impact in the near-term outlook, as well as the medium-term outlook, it is critical that we address the structural constraints to growth that have been really holding us back as an economy and have affected everything else, including the fiscal outlook. And for that reason, initiatives to move with structural reforms are gathering pace, including in the context of Operation Vulindlela. And this slide just gives an update of where we are in that regard. As members will be aware, we consider that electricity supply is one of the key brakes on economic growth. And so in reporting on the progress that we have made, firstly, we are moving on reducing the pressure on the electricity grid, including by adding renewable energy to the grid, as well as making it possible for private power producers to sell electricity directly. Secondly, the corporatization of the National Ports Authority and allowing third parties to access to the freight rail network is also going to be very important. Thirdly, the e-visa system is being rolled out, as Deputy Minister has indicated. Fourthly, the establishment of the National Water Resources Infrastructure Agency. Fifthly, the expansion of the digital communications infrastructure, which we're pushing for finalization next year. And then finally, we have been busy and have concluded during the course of this year, earlier this year, a review of the PPP framework, the public-private partnership framework, including the regulations and rules, in order to make it easier, particularly for smaller and medium-sized projects, to be approved and to proceed for the purposes of partnerships between the private sector and the public sector for those infrastructure projects. And we anticipate implementation early next year. So that's in respect of the structural reforms. On the fiscal strategy, government remains committed to addressing the fiscal imbalances, which means reducing the deficit and stabilizing debt. But as I said at the beginning, this will be done in a balanced fashion. So there will be a balance between using, as honorable members will be aware, the higher tax revenues that we have seen this year, of balancing between supporting the economy, particularly the most vulnerable on the one hand, and on the other hand, narrowing the budget deficit. As I will show in the next slides, the tax revenues that we are seeing are very much associated with the recent commodity price cycle. And because of that, we are also, and because we are seeing those commodity prices start to come down, particularly in the third quarter, the revenues associated with that commodity cycle are also projected to decline over the MTF. And so the balance is very important, but at the same time, it is important to ensure that to avoid widening the budget deficit, the any spending changes as we go into February need to balance between the revenue as well as what we can do in terms of reprioritizing from existing programs of government. With respect to infrastructure projects, there is a blended finance approach on infrastructure projects, as I've alluded to, including for public-private partnerships, but also there will be funding from on budget, in other words, amounts that are already allocated in the capital budgets of departments, but also from the infrastructure fund, which remains with an allocation of 100 billion. So even where instances where there is underspending on the infrastructure fund, it's important for honorable members to be aware that we make sure that the funding for the infrastructure fund is maintained at 100 billion. So even when there's underspending, we always put it back in the following year so that we keep the amounts the same in line with the commitment that we've made on funding infrastructure. But at the same time, as I've said, addressing the fiscal imbalances is important. And we consider that the fiscal framework that we tabled last week is designed to take us to the place where by the middle of the decade, we will have achieved a primary fiscal surplus and therefore be able to bring fiscal consolidation to an end by the end of the upcoming MTF period, barring major new shocks or unbudgeted spending commitments in the framework. And then, of course, finally, the consolidation will be supported by the structural reforms which I've referred to, including as it relates to unlocking private sector investment and job creation, because we consider that is where the difference is going to be made, particularly given the significant fiscal constraints and the crowding out effect of fiscal policy in an environment where debt and debt service costs are high. This is the summarized version of the fiscal framework at the consolidated level. So we are reporting that in the current financial year, we've revised revenue upwards to 1.65 trillion rands for the current year, or at around 26.7% of GDP is the revenue that we've revised up. And that is a 120 billion rands upward revision in revenue due to the performance of the mining sector and the tax revenue coming from there. At the same time, however, expenditure is estimated to reach 2.13 trillion rands in the current year, or at just around 34.5% of GDP. And that includes the additional amounts we've added to the budget to respond to the effects of the third wave of COVID-19, as well as the unrest that took place during the month of July. Put together, then, that means a budget balance of just under 480 billion rands this year, a deficit of 480 billion rands, or 7.8% of GDP. The debt in rand terms will rise to 4.3 trillion rands this year compared to 3.9 last year. But as a percentage of GDP, because of the improvements in revenue, and these numbers are all post-rebasing, both going backwards and forwards, by the way. But as a result of the improved revenue, as well as a significant amount of expenditure discipline, the deficit will be just under 70% of GDP. But then, rather, the debt to GDP ratio will be just under 70% of GDP. So the deficit at 7.8% this year, narrowing gradually to 4.9% of GDP over the MTF period. And that is the path that will enable us to bring fiscal consolidation to an end, as I've indicated. These graphs members will be familiar with. Again, we're providing an update of where we are. As you can see on the left-hand side, the fiscal position that was already weak before the pandemic, and of course the spike between the maroon line and which represents expenditure, and the gray line which represents revenue, that took place as a result of the impact of the pandemic. And of course, the MTF and the proposed fiscal framework aims to narrow that gap until we get to 2024-25. On the right-hand side, it shows the main budget balance, but also disaggregated according to both the primary deficit as well as the interest payments. And you can see how interest payments, or what we call debt service costs, have risen significantly over the years, and now have reached a level where they consume about R1 out of every R5 that was raised in revenue. R1 goes essentially towards paying for debt service costs. But as you can see on the graph, the representation of the primary balance in the outer year. Turning then to the revenue picture, as I've indicated, in the current year, we have revised the revenue projections, mainly because of the surge in commodity prices that South Africa exports. Generally, since last year, towards the end of last year, an improvement in the terms of trade as the oil price also went down. But we are seeing a turnaround in that. We are seeing oil prices go up, but at the same time, the commodities that South Africa exports, the prices of those commodities is currently in decline and is forecast to decline also in 2022. It's also important to remind honorable members and the public that the revenue projections, though they are higher than what we expected at the time of the February budget, they are still lower than the medium-term revenue projections from the 2020 budget. In other words, prior to the impact of the COVID pandemic, where we thought we would be in respect of tax revenue, we are still behind. And until 2022-23, the projections are of a shortfall of 284.7 billion rands compared to where we thought we would be at the time of the February 2020 budget. Because of the terms of trade changes that we are seeing, we are lowering the tax buoyancies, as you can see over the MTF. Of course, this does not mean that we are not working to improve tax revenues. In fact, we consider that a combination of improvements in economic growth, which is the upside scenario, as a result of both improved global dynamics, but also improvements in the implementation of structural reforms, as well as greater tax collection and tax administration by SARS, which should happen as a result of the additions that we've made to the budget of SARS, can actually allow us as we go forward to reconsider where we are in the tax revenues. But for now, given the current macroeconomic and domestic dynamics, the projections for revenue are as you see on the screen. So in the current year, we have made revisions to non-interest expenditure. I'm not going to go through all of these details, except to indicate that on a net basis, changes in non-interest expenditure from the 2021 budget in February to now amount to around 59.4 billion rands. A lot of this is, as I've indicated, to accommodate spending that is related to continued support for the economy, but also there is a provision for additional funding for the wage bill settlement that was reached in August, mainly for provinces. That comes to 20.5 billion, of which about 14.5 billion will go to the 9 provinces. The revised fiscal framework includes also 3 billion rands in the contingency reserve for additional vaccine purchases, as well as an additional provisional allocation to SASRIA for risk coverage in order for them to continue assisting businesses that are rebuilding and restocking following the public violence that took place in July. This is a slide that just provides a recap of the fiscal relief package that was announced at the end of July and tabled in the special appropriation bill that we have obviously requested Parliament to process for the purposes of responding to the needs arising from the July unrest. Now, considering the medium-term outlook, if we look at the improved tax revenue estimates, we consider that they are fairly temporary, but considering those estimates, we propose to maintain some support to the economy over the MTF period. And for that reason, in Chapter 1 of the MTBPS, honorable members will have noted, particularly in Table 1.4, that there is an unallocated reserve, and that is meant to allow a finalization of discussions on the support that can be provided by the fiscus over the medium term, including through a small increase in spending. So that's what that really refers to, and it is the ceiling that we have at this point for dealing with that. And in that context, total main budget non-interest expenditures projected to increase by just under 32 billion next year and just under 30 billion the following year. And of course, the details in this regard will be provided in the 2022 budget. Let me move on then to the next slide to indicate what the Deputy Minister was saying earlier about how the budget of South Africa, the South African government, is structured. Most of the budget goes towards the social wage. Around 60% of consolidated non-interest spending goes towards community development, the social security funds, fee-free higher education, various public employment programs, and other expenditure that is related to the social wage, as well as, of course, basic education, social protection, and health. So the budget is structured in such a way over the MTF that it is very much focused on the social wage, even within the current constrained environment. Notwithstanding the fact that we are tabling over the medium term a decline in the fiscal deficit, it is important for members to be aware that the gross borrowing requirements of government will not decline over the MTF because government will continue needing to issue new bonds and also switching existing bonds in order to reduce redemption. So this refers, honorable members, to debt that was taken out years ago by government that is essentially now coming due and has to be.
Yes. But when I talk about the political economy, we've got it.
Excuse me.
Host, can you please mute those who are interfering with our program here? Edgar, proceed.
Thank you very much, Chair. So because of that, the total borrowing requirements of government will continue to remain elevated over the MTF. And this is an important consideration for us when we think about fiscal policy and fiscal space, is that it's not just about the deficit. Very importantly, it's about the fact that there are other elements that affect the borrowing requirements and the financing requirements of government that need to be taken into account. These things are outlined along with others in Annexure A of the MTBPS. At the main budget level then, the fiscal framework that is proposed is designed, among other things, to stabilize debt in the year 2025-26, and the stabilization is now projected at just over 78% of GDP compared to an estimate of just over 80% of GDP in the 2021 budget. This is due to a narrowing of the deficit, and this is mainly achieved, of course, through controlling increases in spending. Honorable members, this is a summary of, again, the consolidated spending by function. And you can see how debt service costs have become such a huge part of the expenditure. And so for the first time over the MTF, we'll be spending more than R1 trillion just on debt service costs in government finances. Learning and culture, which is dominated by basic and higher education, almost entirely basic and higher education, remains the largest function and the largest item of spending over the MTEF. Looking at it from the perspective of growth rates, what is growing over the MTEF? Again, this reflects the concerning trend around debt service costs. And this is, of course, because of the increase and the size of South Africa's debt stock, which remains unusually high amongst emerging market countries. And so you can see how fast debt service costs are rising over the MTEF. The decline in the social development number is mainly due to the fact that there are a huge amount of once-off items in the current year for social development. And so when you net those out, that number does change. But when you include them, of course, that is why that number is a negative number, so that honorable members and everyone following can be aware of the reasons for that. This is the division of revenue as I head towards a close. As you can see, over the MTEF, we will be increasing the share of both provinces and municipalities of the division of revenue. So in the current year, the national share is 50.6%, but from next year onwards, it will fall below that, and provinces will increase from around 40.9% to 42% of the share of nationally raised revenue, and municipalities will rise from 8.5% to 9.3% next year as a share of the national raised revenue of government. In closing then, let me reflect on the risks and the spending challenges that we're facing. And as I alluded to a few minutes ago, when we consider fiscal policy and fiscal space, we don't just look at the numbers at the main budget level. And we don't just look at the numbers in terms of the simple fiscal balance. We also look at the risks, both the near-term risks as well as the medium-term risks. And that informs our thinking about where fiscal policy should go. In addition to that, what informs our thinking is, as I've indicated a couple of times before, the fact that South Africa's fiscal position was weak prior to the pandemic, and therefore there is a long-run structural problem on the fiscal side that needs to be addressed. But in the slide, we reflect on some of the main risks to the medium-term fiscal framework. The first is, of course, the macroeconomic risks. In other words, a slowdown in the global economy, as well as a slowdown, of course, in the domestic economy. In other words, the durability of the recovery is subject to significant uncertainty. If the economy does not continue to recover at similar levels and we see a significant decline in growth, that means a significant decline in revenue, which is why we are avoiding committing to permanent increases in spending. Because if we commit to permanent increases in spending when the revenue is short-term in nature and the recovery is not durable, that will mean that our fiscal imbalances will once again begin to exacerbate, and we could find ourselves returning to a position that we were in last year, where we were headed towards a fiscal crisis. So we have to be very careful in that regard, and that is a big part of our consideration. The second issue is, of course, the evolution of the pandemic and the fact that, regrettably, we are seeing slow progress in the rollout of the vaccine in South Africa, as well as in several other countries, but certainly in South Africa, vaccine uptake has been slow, and that is having an impact on freeing up the economy. Thirdly, we have had this challenge of slow implementation of structural reforms, and this does need, of course, to pick up. And as I was reflecting earlier, we are seeing some improvements, but this does need to be sustained because this then assists both the fiscus, but also overall the overall long-run trends for economic growth going forward. The fourth risk that we are watching is the possibility of further credit rating downgrades, because this has a direct impact on debt service costs. When we get downgraded, the cost of borrowing rises, and of course, the crowding out effect of those debt service costs on all the other spending becomes worse. And then finally, the public sector wage bill remains a significant risk that we are watching. And as we saw in the current financial year, our ability to be able to, on the one hand, reduce the deficit and also finance a response to supporting the most vulnerable in the economy is counteracted when you have an unbudgeted for increase in the public sector wage bill like we had this year. The 20.5 billion rands that was in the earlier slide was not in the budget, and therefore it meant that we had to partly take it from other things or not fund other things in order to finance it. So the fiscal framework also does not include any additional support to state-owned companies. And this is another major risk factor that we are monitoring very carefully. And in the next A of the MTBPS, you will see, honorable members, that we are projecting that contingent liabilities, mainly arising from state-owned companies, will reach about 1 trillion rands in 2023. So given the fact that there are these major risks, we consider that it's important for the fiscus to be in a position that is stronger over the MTF rather than weaker. Chair, honorable members, I wanted to just indicate, this is a slide that I'm just talking to for the purposes of information. It was not in the set of slides that were on the website, but it's just a recap of the fact that in addition to the MTBPS itself and the adjusted estimates of spending, the tabling last week included numerous bills, as you will have seen, and that is the list of the bills there. That is just a reproduction of what was in the minister's speech. And it also, in addition to the bills, the speech last week by the minister included various provisions that were announced, which I've indicated, including the one for vaccines and for Sastria. And we did want to indicate that the spending bills are critical for the spending plans. And of course, the revenue bills are important because that is how we raise the revenue in order to finance the spending that we are presenting on today. To conclude, then, the points that we've made, government through Operation Vulindlela has made progress on several reforms, and this should help us move above the baseline growth if that momentum is maintained. Over the period ahead, government will continue to narrow the deficit and stabilize debt, mainly through controlling expenditure. And of course, the structural reforms will be important for supporting this because that is the strategy for unlocking the private sector investment that has been suppressed over the last while, as well as job creation in the private sector. Fourthly, we consider the revenue to be a revenue windfall and that it will be used, it'll be divided between addressing the urgent socio-economic challenges on the one hand, and on the other hand, addressing the fiscal imbalances as we go forward. So we've gone for that split between the two. Over the next few years, we are paying much attention to the large increase in debt redemptions associated with the previous spending decisions that had to be financed through borrowing. And for that reason, it is equally important that we set aside a portion of the unanticipated revenue. In closing, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members, the outlook remains highly uncertain. There are major risks, and this includes the durability of the recovery. There is a legal process associated with the public service compensation at the Constitutional Court, as well as future wage negotiations. In the broader public sector, we are monitoring risks around state-owned companies, as well as the fact that the financial distress amongst municipalities has risen significantly over the last number of years. I will stop there, Chair. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, DJ, are you done with the presentation?
Yes, Chair. Thank you very much, Chair. No, we are done. We can then avail ourselves for any clarifications or questions from honorable members. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Edgar. Thanks, DJ. Honorable members, that was the presentation. Are there clarity-seeking questions and comments?
Morning, Chairperson.
Oh, I've muted myself.
Oh, sorry, Chair. Hello, Chair. I wanted to check, are you going to need assistance from us to identify the members that have raised hands, or you can see them on the side?
You can assist. For now, I see Dr. George, Honorable Ryder, Dutoy, Sheikh Imam, Honorable Kaiso.
So far, those are the hands that are visible, Chairperson. Thank you. Over to you, Chair.
Thanks, Dutoy, Imam, Kaiso. I go down. Honorable Abraham. Yeah. There we are. Over to you, Dr. George.
Thank you, Chairperson. The Minister, in his medium-term budget policy statement speech, mentioned tough love for the state-owned enterprises. And we understand there to be no more additional allocations or bailouts. I know the Minister is not here himself, but the Deputy Minister is, so I'm sure that we can get responses from him. Can you explain what this actually means for the state-owned enterprises, this tough love that the Minister's been talking about? And then also the question comes to mind then, will the Minister be extending this tough love to the public sector wage bill? We know that the public sector wage bill is it's basically bloated, and that it is the largest contributor towards the spiraling debt that we have. The former minister said often that action will be taken on this, and I want to know what the current minister is going to be doing about it. Then on economic growth, the minister never mentioned any steps on how government policy is going to improve the environment for business, specifically small, medium, and micro enterprises. I would like to know what policy is doing on that to promote business and making it easier to do business in South Africa, because as we know, that if our economy doesn't grow, we don't get more revenue, and that we are then unable to provide the services that specifically the most vulnerable members of society need, because they get crowded out. And then finally, on the power failures, Eskom is irretrievably broken. The CEO of Eskom has said that himself, and government has mentioned repeatedly about splitting the entity in terms of generation, transmission, and distribution. And the minister did make some mention of additional generation and private sector generation. What can we expect in the short run, given the power crisis that we're facing at the moment? Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Dr. George. Honorable Ryder.
Yes, good morning, Chairperson. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Chair, I have a couple of questions. First of all, a comment. I think that the Minister's apology, I also want to state on record, I'm very unimpressed with the Minister's apology and the fact that he wasn't here today. And I mean no disrespect to the Deputy Minister, and I appreciate his attendance, but the fact that we've had to adjust our program because of last week's cancellation or postponement of the meeting, and then, have the Minister not here in person today to present himself, it just leaves a bad taste in one's mouth. And, it's his first budget appearance, really, and to start off on a bad foot like this, from my point of view, it's unforgivable. Chair, on the questions, and I don't expect a comment from Treasury, that would be unfair, but on the questions, I do think that there's been a substantial step down in terms of the Treasury and the Minister of Finance's position on the wage bill. And this has obviously had a big impact on what's going on in terms of the country's finances. So we have had a large increase that's been agreed to. I know that the government workers would say it's not a very large increase, but there has been an increase that wasn't budgeted for, which is leaving us with a little bit of a hole that we need to fill elsewhere. So my question is, in terms of the medium term, I don't see much movement in terms of the wage bill in a downward way. Certainly, I see the wage bill going up, albeit slightly, over the medium term. I'd just like to get a better indication as to, what are we expecting? Are we expecting to see a shrinking of the size of the government employees, or are we looking at zero increases or very low increases over the medium term? That's the first question, Chair. The next question I have relates to the bandwidth auction. Now, we've heard about this bandwidth auction for quite some time, and it is a key means of unlocking a lot of funds for government, but it should also be a big generator of inputs into the GDP, because I think that it's common cause that an increase in bandwidth availability and cheap bandwidth availability is a booster for the economy generally, and that should, of course, have, in turn, its effect on revenue collection. So I do know that we've been promised this bandwidth auction, I think, for 10 years now, Chair. If we track back, maybe even going on for 11 years, if we go back to the President's State of the Nation speeches. So the fact is, I'm aware that there are a number of legal challenges to the auction. And of course, that also points to the will of government. Now, I can quite happily put my car on the market, but if I attach crazy conditions to putting my car on the market, I'm not going to sell it. So how much will is there really from government side to conclude this bandwidth auction? I note that my TV here in Cape Town again has got a message on the bottom talking about digitalization, but that's not happening, and that needs to happen as well before the bandwidth can actually be done away with. So, what's Treasury pushing for on this? Are we allowing the communications department just to flounder along and ignore the president's instructions, or is there a more urgent need being impressed on the communications department? Chair, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Honorable Ryder. Honorable Dutoy.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. Honorable Chair, it's no state secret that the lockdown regulations that we experienced and are still experiencing in South Africa contributed to the current financial situation that we are in, as well as job losses and a loss of income for SARS. Now, Chair, I posed the question to Minister Dlamini Zuma, whether should we get herd immunity in South Africa, if the disaster period will be uplifted. And our answer was, in short, that that will not be the case. Now, looking at current statistics, it's evidence that about 10 million people more are getting grants from government to survive. We're currently sitting with about 27 million people getting grants to survive at the end of the day. Now, I want to know from National Treasury, what is their expectancy? What do they think, since we will be experiencing slow economic growth and the lockdown regulations will still be with us, and the disaster period not being ended, how do they think will this escalate in the coming years, let's say in the next 2 years? How many more people might be getting social grants from government? And at the end of the day, the financial footprint will still be shrinking because we will not have sufficient economic growth. And we're basically going backwards. If I can just have their view on that. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Honorable Dutoy. Honorable Imam.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thank you for that presentation. My first question is this, that, we talk about economic growth in the country, fiscal consolidation. One of the major problems that we have in the country, that 1 in 2 people are unemployed. Now, my question is, are we doing enough to create a conducive environment for job creation rather than have people dependent on the state for social assistance? Now, my view is that indeed we are not. And I think some of my colleagues have alluded to it in some way or the other. We have not created a conducive environment for businesses to thrive in South Africa. Firstly, the demands on the manufacturing industry, the high labor cost, the pressure that they get from labor unions makes it very difficult. They cannot be competitive. And unless they become competitive, you're not going to create jobs. And the jobs must be created in the private sector, not in the public sector. We know about our high wage bill that we have currently, and repeatedly we've heard year in and year out that we're going to be reducing it, but clearly nothing of that sort appears to be happening. So I'd like to know, what are we going to do? Now, you've got a success story here in the manufacturing sector, in the automotive section of it. What about the textile and the leather industry and the others, which has been impacted by your cheap imports, your labor and stringent labor conditions, and government has not sat down with these different role players and come to a common understanding and agreement where we can relax some of these stringent regulations, so that we could make these people more successful and, of course, create more jobs. Remember, creating jobs is paramount for economic growth, because the more people are employed, the more money they will earn, the more they will spend, the more money there will be in circulation. And we don't have that situation right now. So that's my first issue. The second issue is this, we are talking about putting in further mechanisms to make funding available for small businesses. 200 billion rand guarantee was given during COVID. Only 20 billion rand was used, and that was because of the stringent conditions there once again. And if the reason why people didn't take it on is because if they could meet those conditions, they didn't need the money at all. Now, how are we going to actually deal with that so greater support can be given to these small businesses so they can drive economic growth? The other problem with economic growth is 2 factors. One is you need water and you need energy. And we have a crisis with both. I can tell you, you're going to need billions of rands to get your water infrastructure going in this country. And by the time you solve your energy crisis, another year or 2 years is going to go. So all your projections is going to fall flat, means we're not going to be able to achieve what we want. Your intentions are very good, but the reality on the ground says something else. Let's look at the state-owned entities very quickly. We welcome the decision not to provide more funding to the state-owned entities. But let us not forget that those guarantees and that we have given, we've only given guarantees. What is going to happen if these state-owned entities default? Surely we're going to have to come to their rescue. What is going to be the situation as far as that is concerned? Now, we have spoken about the issue of transport freight. I'm just not clear how we're going to implement this, particularly when third parties are going to use our freight rail network, even though I can tell you that we know we have serious problems in terms of our, accept what you're saying. And I think it's the first time we're hearing this. Every time we brought up the issue of public debt, we were told, no, it's normal. It's normal. All countries borrow. We were given examples like Japan and things. And it's the first time we're starting to hear now that really it's a problem with this cost of the debt running almost going to go into 5.5 trillion rand in 24-25. My problem is this, and you are correct when you say a lot of the money is being used in this country for consumption, even what you're borrowing. How are we going to be able to turn that around and make sure that that money is spent towards economic growth through infrastructure development? Now, I like what we say about infrastructure, and you're correct there once again. That's where economic growth can come from. However, we know that in terms of infrastructure development in this country, we have a major problem in implementation. There's been underspending and the capacity to be able to implement those projects. Lastly, I think I want to go on to the issue which I think can help. And to some extent, I may be deviating. However, your public procurement bill. We have a crisis in the country in terms of revenue. There's no doubt about it, because our expenditure far exceeds it. And one of the reasons for that is because you don't get value for money. Even yesterday, Chairperson, somebody called me for an urgent meeting and I didn't know what it was about. Shocked to find that they called me to tell me that they've heard that we too are going to be in coalitions and run certain municipalities. So they want to talk about tenders and procurement. And I want to tell you, hundreds of billions of rands is being lost through the procurement system. And I know that we are busy with the procurement bill. As a matter of urgency, can National Treasury do something about ensuring that we get value for money? Let us have a transparent and credible process from local governments. I promise you, you're going to save a lot of money if you can make sure that all these tenders, even after issued, is advertised with whoever got these tenders, at what price we paid for each item. I promise you, you've heard your previous CEO has said 40% on goods and services is lost as a reason for not getting value for money. Chief Justice Mogoeng said exactly the same thing. I plead with you to do something in that respect. Chairperson, thank you very much.
Thanks, Honorable Imam. Honorable Tyson.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. I think it's important to start here. Firstly, I would like to appreciate the explanation that was given to us about the absence of the minister. And it will be really unfair to just condemn that explanation from what Dr. Dennis George was saying. So there's nothing that you can do naturally when somebody is reported ill that can convert it to a positive for now. But we appreciate that we have been given a very detailed the reasons for the absence of the minister.
So it will be unfair to just condemn it in that manner. So I just wanted to indicate that we appreciate that explanation and actually accept that apology which was given at the beginning of the meeting. Mine, Chairperson, it is not really much, but it was on the area. I see the projections, I think it's on slide 6 of the growth of the economy jumping to 5.1, if I'm not mistaken, in 21-22. But then years thereafter would slide to a level of growth of by 1 point. I just wanted to get it clear what shall have influenced that sudden drop to that projection of up to 1% growth. Secondly, is on the issue that was raised on the fiscal framework does not support additional support to the state-owned companies. I think the state-owned companies play a very pivotal role towards, growth of the economy. So I just wanted to get into what is a breakdown of not support or additional support, so that one can understand it better. I might think of something wrong being what is meant here. So I just want to understand what is not to support state-owned companies, because several of them had been on the, downward, direction. So whether is it financial, and at the same time, I see that there's a possibility of bailouts being expected in future. I'm trying to look at not support the support, and also looking at what it says to mean bailout in future. So I just want to get the clarity so that I'm very clear about the issue on the support. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thanks, Honorable Tyson. Honorable Abraham, Noxie.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody in the meeting. A very good morning to the Deputy Minister, especially. Chairperson, I only have 3 takers regarding what has been presented, and the presentation is much appreciated. It indeed unpacks the summary that was made by the Minister in the House. Where I want to start, Chair, is where Edgar ended his presentation, because he ends with the fiscal situation in municipalities. And considering that we are in the recent past from local elections that were preceded by protests in various areas. My question is, what kind of assistance do we give to our municipalities, specifically in as far as financial controls are concerned? I'm also, Chair, asking this question with the background in mind that the Minister did mention how many hundreds, I think, of municipalities that are in financial distress, and some of them are even now managed to a certain extent by the ministry. So what is it that we are doing at the level of Treasury to assist in local government regarding this? My second take, Chair, is with regards to the private sector involvement in economic growth. I know that as government, we are concerned about jobs, we are concerned about the poverty that's unending. We are also concerned about inequalities. And my question is whether we do have some kind of bilaterals with the private sector so that we significantly draw in their participation, whether it's through policy, strategy, or whatever. I would like to know, how do we as a treasury initiate or have them participating significantly in terms of what we are already doing as government? The last one, Chair, for me, is the issue of the spat that exists between Treasury and labor unions in the public sector. I get it that already there's a huge percentage that's been presented in terms of what is already being paid towards salaries. But my question is, what is this agreement that seems to exist between government and labor unions? And what is the position now in terms of that kind of agreement and what is happening currently between labor and National Treasury specifically? Thank you, Chairperson.
Thanks, Honorable Abraham. Honorable Mlenzan.
Thanks, Chairperson. Good morning. Team Treasury is led by the Deputy Minister. And ladies and gentlemen and the media. Mine, Chairperson, it's just a few. Let me perhaps start by wishing the Minister well and echoing what Honorable Kais was just raised, that we cannot do otherwise if a person has got that challenge of ill health. There's nothing much that one can do, just to pray that the Minister gets well soon. Hopefully he will, and we'll meet him. Then on the questions or comments, I've got just a few, Chairperson. On the adjustment of appropriation bill. Chairperson, notwithstanding government's guarantee obligation, I had the Minister